Hey everybody, Mr. Norell here again for another music intro or intro to music video. For today, we're going to be focusing on the Romantic period. We are about halfway into chapter unit 6 right now, and today our topic will turn to the great German composer Richard Wagner, as well as the great Russian composer Tchaikovsky. Previous to this, we've been talking about piano music of Chopin and Liszt, as well as the Italian opera of Verdi. And today we're going to, again, look at these German composers. Now, just a couple of quick things to recap, though, before we do so. First of all, we are in the Romantic period. So this is a period of emotion, a period of emotion over form, much different than the classical period that preceded it, where form takes precedent over a composer's emotions. We also see during this Romantic period this tremendous amount of nationalism, pride in one's country, which in a certain sense is why these composers are being taught to you by geographical location. The French composers, the Italian composers, and today we're talking about the Germans and the Russians. All right, it's because every country, every region of Europe, including Russia, had different characteristics to the music that was being composed. In some cases, as other teachers have discussed with you in previous videos, we see the use of a lot of folk music in the compositional work of these composers. So they might pull in ideas from the local culture, like we talked about Chopin bringing in these nocturnes and other types of folk music into his classical piano pieces. And guys like Wagner and Tchaikovsky are going to be no stranger to this as well. So let's kind of dive into things here in talking about the great German composer, Mr. Richard Wagner. Now, Wagner, I love this quote, one of my favorites. Imagination creates reality. It's this sense of what we perceive as the world that we live in is only limited by our imagination, right? Richard Wagner was very much a philosopher in this way. In fact, if you ask Richard Wagner, he probably would not necessarily consider himself a composer by the normal definition of the word. Right? He is incredibly he's a very deep individual, a lot of depth to some of his thoughts and his beliefs. And it's interesting to see how that will carry over into some of his music. He is the opposite of, say, a great composer like Felix Mendelssohn. Right? Felix Mendelssohn was a phenomenal composer that we really didn't cover too much this year. But he came from a very rich and wealthy background, whereas Wagner was very poor. His dad dies at a very early age, and his mom remarries a gentleman who is very involved in theater. In fact, he was an actor, this gentleman. And it exposes the young Richard Wagner to literature and drama. And Wagner had this love of Shakespeare, and it's through these people that he starts to become very interested in eventually opera. His idols were Shakespeare and Beethoven. Those that we do know from his writings. He worked very hard. He worked very hard for 20 years to learn the ideas and the beliefs and the theory behind composition by directing and writing plays in small companies around Germany. All right, and a lot of his shows really just didn't work out very well because they weren't successful. Wagner creates or amasses a large amount of debt. And he kind of moves from town to town to avoid the debt collectors and avoid being thrown in prison. Meanwhile, Mendelssohn, very rich, very famous, really didn't have a care in the world, had more money than he knew what to do with. Now, Wagner, this poor life that he lived, this difficult life that he lived, led him to have kind of a hard soul, very similar to Beethoven, right? Very kind of just down in the dumps, just bad luck was always on his side kind of mentality. But he believed himself to be a genius, and he was. And eventually he will go on to create some amazing pieces of music. He will become known for his long and serious and powerful operas. And he also writes his own librettos, right? He writes his own text, his own stories, his own words to the music in the pieces, which is very different. A lot of times composers of opera would have a librettist, somebody who wrote the words basically, whereas the composer would take care of the music. But Wagner was a little different in that sense, that he was just as focused on the text and the words of his operas that he was with the story and the music. All right. He calls for much bigger orchestration. You may recall that the word orchestration means who we are assigning parts to in the orchestra. So am I giving a melody to this group of instruments or that group of instruments? Am I giving it to the brass players? Am I giving it to the strings? Am I giving it to the winds or the reeds and things like that? But Wagner in his compositions will be very specific with the amount and the number of people he wants in that pit orchestra, in the orchestra that is performing the music for the opera. And he will specifically call for a larger number of brass instruments, tubas, trombones, trumpets, French horns, that sort of thing. And he will use these instruments in a very creative and innovative way, which we'll talk about. He even goes as far to compose a treatise. A treatise is like a scholarly paper, kind of like say a manifesto or an intelligent document that outlines and presents an idea. And then not only presents the idea, but then backs it up with thought and research and philosophy. Remember what I said, Wagner very much considered himself a very philosophical man, and in many ways viewed his musical works as more than just music for entertainment purposes. So it makes sense that here we have this philosopher / composer writing a treatise in which he is advocating, right? He is making the case for opera and drama and its roles in life, and also the important ways in which it should be written and performed. So he's very, I would say he's very stern in this sense. He's very rigid in his beliefs. He's very straightforward in what he thinks to be true and how he wants things done. And because of this, he kind of puts off a lot of people, but he also draws people in because he develops what is known as the music drama, right? And it is seen as this kind of endless melody. He doesn't call his operas operas, he calls them musical dramas because, again, he sees his works as this ongoing sort of perpetual idea where it's telling a story, but not just a story that you're seeing on stage, but maybe a life lesson, maybe some hidden stories, some hidden agenda, if you will, in his compositions. And to this, he develops a technique known as leitmotif. And if you've ever watched the movie Star Wars, you have experienced leitmotif. Now, hold on. Hit the pause button for a second here. George Lucas composes Star Wars. And by the way, I can't play the tune because the copyright people will come after me on YouTube. But in your playlist, there will be plenty of examples of what I'm talking about here. So leitmotif, if you ever watch Star Wars, Darth Vader walks into the room and you have the march of the stormtroopers. Bum, 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 ba bum, bum, ba bum, right? George Lucas is obviously the director, the genius behind that piece of cinema. But a little gentleman, not very well known, a little sarcasm there, very well known actually, by the name of John Williams is the composer for that. And John Williams is the genius that came up with that melody. But in a certain way, John Williams and George Lucas assign that melody to the figure of Darth Vader. And that figure, every time we see him on screen, we hear that melody. So again, we're taking that musical theme and using it to identify a person in the story. Well, guess what? These guys back in the 70s and 80s and even today, in modern music and movies, they were not the first ones to do this. We can trace this idea of assigning a musical theme to a character. We can trace this all the way back to Richard Wagner. All right, and his belief of leitmotif, right? And leitmotif is just that. It's assigning a musical theme to a person in an opera or an object or even an emotion or a thought. So this is something that we see in Wagner's great opera, The Ring Cycle. And we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment. So it is the operas that he writes, and we'll kind of go down this rabbit hole here for a little bit. The operas that he writes are extraordinary works. They are incredibly long. They require degrees of stamina, not just for the instrumentalists in the pit, but also for the singers and the actors and actresses on stage. His pieces have ranges that are incredibly high, incredibly low. He will physically challenge the ability of the performers. Richard Wagner's works, even to this day, are known as really pieces that are only performed by the best of the best. Many years ago, the Metropolitan Opera House here in New York completed the Ring Cycle, which is a monumental, tremendous feat for an opera company to do. And it's not done very frequently. It's done rather infrequently, actually. And they spent the better part of a year performing these massive operas. And I remember watching interviews with many of the performers on stage and the musicians in the pit, and them all just remarking about how incredibly challenging being a performer and doing these works, how incredibly challenging that was. All right, but he is very long-winded in his musical tones and his musical pieces, and that leads to some incredibly challenging music as well. Again, remember, he's going to also call for tremendous orchestration. He's going to require more musicians in the pit. He's going to require larger theaters, larger companies. And to that end, he actually has the Wagnerian societies. The Wagnerian societies are these dedicated groups of individuals who will fund and finance the creation of an opera house. And this opera house is designed just for Richard Wagner. It is built so that his operas have a home. They have a place, a physical place that is big enough, that can accommodate as many people as necessary, as well as many animals and props on stage, that we can then partake in and enjoy. Now, he goes on to create some amazing operas. And his most notable opera is The Ring Cycle. The Ring Cycle is a tremendous piece of music. And the idea of The Ring Cycle is this. It is a mythical story, and it is spread between 4 different operas. And these operas, when performed together, are incredibly long. It takes him nearly 19 years to complete writing this piece of music. But when it is done, this enormous piece of work will be one gigantic epic tale. We are talking about a period, a group of music that is 14 plus hours of music. It's tremendous. The Ring Cycle is 4 total operas. Flight of the Valkyries, or Ride of the Valkyries. I always say Flight of the Valkyries, sorry. Ride of the Valkyries is a very famous melody and very famous piece within the opera. It's actually in the second opera. And it is, like I said, probably one of the more famous pieces of music, and it's a great example of leitmotif. He will also use leitmotif in other places. There are a handful of links in your YouTube playlist that I would encourage you to check out at this point in the video to see what I'm talking about. There's a great video that explains the Ring Cycle from back when an opera house in Sydney performed the Ring Cycle. It's a wonderful advertisement that is actually very educational. So we've included that in your playlist. I've also included a couple other videos about leitmotif and how Wagner uses leitmotif, everything from certain characters to the ring itself. And by the way, this is not the Hobbit Lord of the Rings ring. This is it's a similar but separate story. This story came first, just to clarify. And then we also have the Bridal March, the Flying Dutchman, another great piece of music and work by Richard Wagner. So these are all pieces worthy of your time. I would encourage you to check out Mr. Wagner's works. And now we will transition over to the great Tchaikovsky. All right, and so finally we have Peter Tchaikovsky here, born 1840 to 1893. And Tchaikovsky is a Russian composer. So we have Wagner, the German, and Tchaikovsky, the Russian. All right, but he is far more universal, and he's not as nationalistic as others. In other years, we would talk about the Russian Five, which were 5 great Russian composers who were very nationalistic, very involved in the pride of Russia and the composition of Russian music. However, Tchaikovsky doesn't subscribe to their methods. The Russian Five almost will shun him at one point. But Tchaikovsky is this nationalistic composer that will be open to Western music. So he's open to the ideas and the teachings of guys like Bach and Beethoven and Brahms and other composers that either are living during his time or coming before him. He learns from them. Whereas some of the other Russian composers in this time were kind of had blinders on as nationalist composers. They didn't look to Western Europe as a place of inspiration. They truly felt that Russian music was the true one great music of the time period, and Russian folk music should be the only place that a composer seeks inspiration. Tchaikovsky didn't subscribe to this. So Tchaikovsky saw the value in looking at Western European music and learning from the other great composers of his time, and like I said, those that came before him. He is considered the finest of the Russian composers in this time period, and he is known as the true Russian romantic. He is that one Russian composer that is composing in the romantic styles of the time period, and not just in the Russian styles of the time period. He studies law and works as a law clerk prior to his musical career, and he composes in nearly every form of music, everything from symphonies to short symphonic poems, these one-work pieces of music that were based on a literary story, or he composes operas, much bigger pieces of music, obviously, and concertos and sonatas and things like that. He's one of the first composers that we're going to study that actually visits the U.S. He opens Carnegie Hall. It's his music and his conducting that opens Carnegie Hall for the first time, and Carnegie Hall has been, with us ever since. And very interesting story. He works for a very wealthy widow. Nazar von Meck. And Madame von Meck, they never actually meet. She will send him correspondence. She will send him money. She is a benefactor of sorts, or a philanthropist. And she funds him, and her funding is what allows him to focus on creating music. It's almost like she, in some scholarly readings and so forth, historians believe that she felt it obligated to fund Tchaikovsky so that he would not have to worry about making ends meet. He would not have to worry about working side jobs. This would allow him to focus 110% on composition and honing his craft and being a true master of composition. So she felt that by sending him this money, that she could entitle him to pursue his musical endeavors without having any other additional burdens or anything else to worry about. Very, very interesting. I would love to have somebody fund me so I could go off and explore the world and try all the things I'd never get a chance to do. But alas, Mr. Tchaikovsky lived a very, very good life in that sense. But is perhaps his ballet that he is most known for. And if you've ever watched a Christmas commercial, you've probably experienced some of his ballet. All right, the Nutcracker, there is a link here, and we've specifically pointed out a couple of spots in the ballet that we think you really should focus on. So we have the 8-minute mark, the hour and 13-minute mark, the hour and 29, hour-and-a-half minute mark. I would encourage you to jump to those and check out some of the things. Of course, if you want to watch the full ballet, by all means, go right ahead, but you need a few hours of free time to do that. And then, of course, we have Sleeping Beauty, which we all know probably from the Disney classic. We have Swan Lake, Romeo and Juliet, and then, of course, the great 1812 Overture. And this is truly a true concert overture, right? It's an overture in the sense that we would see at maybe the beginning of an opera or some other work for stage, but it's a concert overture, so it's meant to stand alone, but it's part of a story. In this case, it's about the War of 1812. Now, hold on, American history buffs, time out again. It's not about the War of 1812 in this country. It's about the Russian Revolution, which also took place in 1812. So don't every year I go, oh yeah, the War of 1812. That was so nice of this Russian guy to write a story about American wars in America. No, it was nothing to do with us. Sorry. It has everything to do with Russia. And like we talked about, he's a nationalistic composer. Now, there's a great example of how he's nationalistic, but he composes in such a way that he's very Western European romantic, right? He uses some Russian folk music, but not solely Russian folk music like the other Russian composers. And he will even use real cannons. He will call for real cannon fire, which you can check out in the video link included in your YouTube playlist. A lot of YouTube playlists happening in this chapter. Unfortunately, we can't show a lot of this stuff without the YouTube copyright police coming after us. So there's a quick rundown of Tchaikovsky, quick rundown of Wagner. I hope you've enjoyed our little time here together. And again, please take the time to look over these listening examples. There is some phenomenal music. I personally am a huge fan of Wagner and Tchaikovsky, which is why I'm so glad I got to do this module for you. But I would encourage you to check out some of those links, because it's really some remarkable music. And I guarantee you're listening to this going, oh, I've heard that music before. I've heard that on a commercial. I've heard that in a movie. And it came from these guys long before film, long before major motion pictures, long before Stanley Kubrick and Apocalypse Now and all these other great movies that use some of this music, like Flight of the Valkyries. But we want to just understand that this stuff came first, and then later on, we have directors going, oh yes, let me use this wonderful piece of classical music in my film. So again, thank you for tuning in. Please don't forget to check your Schoology assignments. Please don't forget to get the Google Doc in, and also don't forget that we have some assessments coming up. Make sure you get those in on time as well. Attend your office hours, and of course, if you have any questions at all, please send any of your intro to music teachers, myself, Mr. Vegas, Mrs. Ticelli. Please send us an email, and we'll get right back to you. Thanks so much, and have a wonderful day, everybody. Take care.